Welcome to Compass, Finding Spirituality in the Everyday. My name is Ryan Dunn. Are you sometimes afraid to ask questions about faith and spirituality? Does doubt scare you a little bit? Do you have some questions that you're skeptical about ever finding the answers for? This is the podcast for you, and this is a great episode for you as well, if you don't mind me saying. In this episode of Compass, I spoke with writer Debie Thomas. Debie's spiritual journey has been marked by inquiry. At an early age, she had questions about the nature of goodness and divine responsibility. She openly wondered why people attribute all the good in the world to God, yet often feel restricted from expressing frustration or anger about life's hardships. Does that feel a little bit familiar, perhaps? We're going to get into Debie's journey and explore how she reconciles all of this stuff in faith today. If you appreciate the value that our show brings to your day, we'd be incredibly grateful if you could take a moment to leave us a rating and review. Your feedback not only helps us improve the show, but it also makes a huge difference in helping more listeners like you find us. Here's how you can leave a rating and review. On Apple Podcasts, open your Apple Podcasts app on your phone or computer, search for Compass, Finding Spirituality in the Everyday, and then scroll down to the ratings and reviews section. Tap the stars to rate the podcast, and if you have a moment, write a few words about what you enjoy about the show in the review section. On Spotify, you just have to launch the Spotify app on your mobile device and head to our podcast page. Below the podcast title, you'll see a rating section represented by stars. Tap that maximum rating to rate us. Although Spotify doesn't support written reviews yet, those stars really do count. On YouTube, head over to the YouTube channel and find Compass, Finding Spirituality in the Everyday. After watching an episode, hit the like button to show your support and leave a comment to tell us and other viewers what you thought. Your comments help increase our visibility on YouTube and grow our community. And don't forget to subscribe and click that bell icon so that you never miss out on our content. Alrighty. As noted, we're talking with Debie Thomas, author of A Faith of Many Rooms. She's also a columnist and contributing editor for the Christian Century. Debie's perspective is one of an explorer and a doubter and a wonderer, like you. So let's meet her on the Compass Podcast. Welcome to the Compass Podcast, Debie. Thank you so much for joining us. How goes it with your soul this morning?
Oh, well, thank you first of all, Ryan, for having me. It's a privilege to be here. It goes well with my soul. We are finally getting some sunshine here in California, which is a nice thing. And this is Lent, which is a really meaningful season for me. So I'm doing well. Thank you.
Yeah, well, now that you've brought up this season of Lent, is there a practice that you're taking on through these 40 days or something that you're leaving out?
So in our church, we're together reading Kate Bowler's book of devotional and blessings, Lenten blessings. And so moving through that together with my community is really wonderful because she opened up this really vulnerable, honest space to talk about real life, which is always refreshing.
Yes. Yeah. A great way of communicating. And it comes from such an honest space. And and really, I've noticed through your writings that so do you. And I want to get into some of your story a little bit. We can go way, way back. You mentioned early in your book that you were kind of a brat who was asking all the wrong questions growing up in the church. So what were some of the questions that you found were getting you in a little bit of trouble or that people were just feeling a little bit irksome about?
Sure. So, I mean, really young, what about the dinosaurs? The earth doesn't really have a bowl of water like on top of it. So what's up with Genesis?
Yeah.
Why is God a boy? That was a big one for me.
Ooh.
And what does it mean for me to be also created in the image of God if God is male? That was a question I wrestled with from childhood all the way into young adulthood. It was a really tough one. And then I think, why do we give God credit for all the good stuff, but then we're not allowed to be angry at the bad stuff? That was one that, my Sunday school teachers did not like me for those questions too much.
Would they try to answer or was there a dodge?
The dodge was usually, we need to have faith. These things are
Okay.
mysteries. We are small and human, and God is big, and God knows things that we don't know. And so we just have to have more faith.
Yeah.
Which just put me in this position of shame, because then, the first place I went was, well, then there's something wrong with me because I don't have enough. My faith is not big enough to encompass these questions and to let them be.
Oh, so if you're unsettled by the questions, then it's just that, yeah, okay.
Yeah.
You're not picking up what God is putting down, in a sense.
Yes, exactly.
Hmm.
Exactly.
Are you asking similar questions today?
I think so. But I think I've made my peace with the questions. Like, I've decided that the fact that I'm asking is a sign of a robust relationship with God. It is not a problem. I don't pathologize that. The fact that I'm asking means that I have a stake in this game, that I care, and that God is big enough to meet me in those questions. I have let go of my anxiety about finding answers, because some of these questions just don't have answers that we can know, at least this side of eternity. So, but the asking is valuable in and of itself, because it means that I'm engaged.
Well, I'm curious. You have a position of leadership in your church and have probably been put in the Sunday school teacher type
Sure.
of role.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
When you come up against some of these imponderable questions or questions that you don't know the answer to, how do you typically respond?
Sure. Well, our whole approach in the church where I attend now, especially with children, is to invite them to wonder. We don't offer the stories of Scripture as black and white. We offer them as places that people can explore. Step into the story. What do you notice? What do you wonder? And we even ask. This is based on the godly play curriculum that we often use for children, which invites us to ask, if you could lose some parts of the story and still have all the story you need, what would you leave out? So for example, if we teach Noah's Ark, right, story, which is a really problematic story for kids.
Yeah, as we dive into the whole version of it, absolutely.
Exactly. So we invite them to ask, what parts of the story, work, and which parts would you leave out if you could? And inevitably the children would say, we'd leave out the part that God made the flood happen to kill people. And so then we sit with that and go, okay, so what if these ancient people experienced a terrible disaster, and they were trying to make sense of it and trying to think about how God could still be good and gracious to them in the midst of trying to understand something really complicated that happened in nature. And that just opens up a space for them to think about it differently without attributing sort of monstrosity to God. So that's just kind of an example of how we approach it.
Yeah. Well, isn't it wonderful that we kind of give permission to wonder like that within a children's ministry setting? But I wonder if we feel a sense of moving towards wonderment within adult settings.
That's a great question. I don't think we do enough of it.
Mm-hmm.
I think we have an anxiety about that people will just sort of wander off. We need to keep people in the room of a certain kind of orthodoxy, and if they wander too far, then it's not Christian anymore.
Yeah.
And I think a lot underneath that is this real anxiety about God, that God is some kind of like fine china teacup, and what if God shatters? And I think we need to have more courage than that. God is not a teacup. God can handle the most intense questions. And Scripture is testament to that. People railed against God. They raged. They wondered. They grieved. They fought. They wrestled. This is part of faith. It's not the antithesis of faith.
Yeah, one of the key words of the Psalms seems to be why. You get
Why?
the sense that
Exactly.
the authors of the Psalms are fairly anxious people who are
Yes.
struggling really to not just make sense of God, but everything that happens in their world.
Exactly. And they're often writing from context of deep trauma. We're reading these accounts of deeply traumatized people, colonized people, and enslaved people, and exiled people. And so, of course, their relationship with God would be contested and hard. And that should give us permission, to be able to engage in those ways too.
Yeah. And yet we fall into this trap where the faith community kind of becomes this place of movement towards certainty and definition.
Yes, absolutely.
Well, this is why I think that your book, A Faith of Many Rooms, is going to connect with so many people, because there's a longing out there for a sense of mystery and a freedom to ask the questions and to process through. Uh, you note that one of the reservations that people have about defining faith, especially Christian faith, is that it can be pinpointed into being too blank, too inhospitable, too
Yeah.
masculine, as you've already noted, too narrow or too particular. Was there an event within your own life that broadened your understanding of what Christianity could be outside of those two blank bounds?
Sure. So, I grew up in a pretty cloistered evangelical community. And so
Okay.
I kind of didn't know that anything else existed, or if everything else that existed was wrong. We
Mm,
uniquely in our faith community had figured this out correctly, and other people who claimed to be Christian were just, wrong. Um,
mm,
and that, when you're offered that as a child, you kind of, okay, that's what the grown-ups say, and it is what it is. And then I think it happens for many people. I went to college, and suddenly, the world got a lot bigger. I was
yeah.
meeting Christians from very different traditions, more liturgical traditions, mainline traditions. I was meeting people of other faiths or no faith, and having to be in conversation with them. And first of all, realizing these are really wonderful people. These are
Mm.
these are not these are not, I was taught that they were all just bad.
Yeah, they're not leading me towards the dark side, really? Oh,
Exactly. Yeah, they
okay.
are complex and interesting, and they're asking really, wonderful questions that I care about too. Um, and then I ended up taking some classes. I took a history of Christianity class with a feminist scholar. And oh my goodness, talk about having my world blown open, right?
Mm,
Suddenly learning that in the early decades of Christianity, women were leading, women were apostles and deacons, and then learning about how that kind of closed down as Christianity, as the institution wrapped itself, around a more patriarchal way of doing church. All of that was brand new to me. And suddenly I just realized there's so much I don't know. There was so much that was walled off from me. And now okay, my curiosity is piqued. I must know. And I have to unravel this and figure it out.
mm. For a lot of people, they come up with questions like that, and their perspective gets broadened, and then they choose to leave behind the faith of the past. But that
Sure.
hasn't been your story. You've stayed in the faith. Was there something that kept you moored within the faith?
It's a great question. I've asked myself, and Ryan, I don't.
Hmm.
There's a sense in which faith is a mystery, right? And
Hmm.
I'm grateful that my journey did not include completely leaving. I mean, I took vacations. There were seasons when sitting in church and listening to certain kinds of sermons was so painful. I really felt
Mm.
like there was no oxygen in the room, and so I left. Or when reading the Bible just became so hard because I no longer knew what the Bible was. So there were definitely seasons of stepping away. But I think what brought me back was curiosity, was a sense of this is a very big tradition. People have been asking these questions for thousands of years. And if they were able to continue, then I can find a way too. So that leaning into that, I guess, that communion of saints, or that the fact that there's an ancestry here, it's not just about me, that helps bring me back as well.
I love that image of kind of taking faith vacations. I mean, not that I want people to have a sense that they need to leave their faith behind for a bit, but just in that feeling of comfort, like there's an ebb and a flow,
Yes.
and that having a bit of respite, even from something as profound and meaningful as the faith community, can be a little bit healthy. When you've been called back from those vacations, do you generally find it's because of a sense of calling beyond yourself, or are you having to do the work,
Oh,
or
that's
both?
beautiful. Yeah. So that's been a big shift for me from this idea of faith as something that I do. I have to make it happen. I have to not only go to church, but go with just that right, sensibility, the right emotional architecture, and like with my sheer piety, just the force of my, love of Jesus, I'm going to make something spiritual happen. That's a tremendous burden to put on yourself. It's painful to do that. It's very different to approach faith as God is doing this, the Spirit is doing this, and the larger community holds this with me. So, for
Mm,
example, there might be Sundays when I'm sitting in church and we get to the proper, we recite the Nicene Creed, and I'm thinking, seriously?
Yeah.
This is not happening today. There are parts of this that are just like bonkers. But
Mm.
the people who are sitting all around me, they hold it for me that day. They recite it not just for themselves, but on my behalf. And then maybe 2 Sundays later, I'm in a really good, strong place, and the person sitting next to me is really struggling. At that point, I hold it for them. So that we're
Mm.
in this together, it's communal and collaborative, and not just me and my Jesus and me and my Bible figuring it out all yourself.
I identify with that. A number of times where I've been in the worship setting, and especially when it comes around music, and
Sure.
people are super into it, and I have a sense of guilt for not having the emotional response that those folks have. But,
Yeah.
it's refreshing to think about, well, maybe they're carrying me in this moment in which I do feel detached and
Yeah.
not feeling an emotional aspect to my faith. Mm.
Yeah, that's a lot of pressure to have it all come down to your affective experience. I
Mm.
was really taught that way. You have to feel Jesus. You have to feel Jesus' arms around you. And I would just think, that's just not how I am in the world. I don't,
Yeah.
I can maybe count on one hand the number of times I have felt that. But to come to a place where I can trust that this truth is true, regardless of how I feel about it on any given day. It doesn't depend on that.
Mm. Well, one of the chapters that I really identified with in your book is when you talk about lostness, and said it in the sense of we kind of wander and
Hmm.
lose our way, and that's not altogether bad. That we can discover some beautiful things through being lost and wandering. My fear is that when I'm lost, that I'll never be found again.
Yes,
That
of
I will
course.
stay out in the wilderness. How do you keep lostness from unraveling your faith?
Such a good question. I think you tell people that you are lost. You don't go
Mm,
off by yourself.
okay.
You have people who are kind of tethering you, or at least checking in on you. That's been really important to me. I lean pretty heavily into the temptation story of Jesus as Mark describes it. In Mark's very, very short version, there's
Mm,
no big elaborate narrative. There's just the Spirit threw Jesus into the wilderness. He was there for 40 days, and there were wild beasts and angels there with him. And so
mm,
that combination of like the Spirit is there, Jesus is there, wild beasts are there, and angels are there. All of these things coexist together in the wilderness, which means that really hard things are going to happen. They're going to be the wild beasts, there's going to be the danger and the risk, but there are also angels. There's also care. There's also surprising moments of rest and nourishment, and love. Those will come too. You just have to learn to look for them. Angels in the wilderness look different from angels, when you're sitting in church and you feel lovely. It might be a different kind of manifestation, but there's still grace in the wilderness.
mm. Well, it sounds like you found a very healthy and supportive community of faith right now in your church. Were there certain signs that you were able to pick up on that suggested to you, like, oh, this would be the right community of faith for me?
Sure. So as I was going through the kind of deconstruction process, leaving my childhood faith tradition, I wandered all over. I went to all different kinds of churches for a while. For a while, I didn't go anywhere. I just sat at home and tried to do my own thing.
Mm,
And then we moved out to California about 13 years ago. And I walked into this Episcopal church on a Sunday morning. And for the first time in my life, I saw a woman, an Asian American woman, preach and preside over the Eucharist.
mm,
And I sobbed straight through the liturgy, just sat there and cried because I'd never seen that before. I didn't know that was possible. It was beautiful, and to see the love of God embodied in someone who looked like me. And that's okay. That is not only okay, that is good. That
mm.
here's a picture of the kingdom of God broadened beyond anything that I had conceived of. So yeah, I called her the next day, and then I annoyed her for months with my questions. I was always in her office, like, but what about this? What about salvation? What about sin? What about the Bible?
Mm.
And she very patiently did that work with me, gave me things to read, told me it was okay to be asking these questions. So I knew this was a place to stay.
Hmm. Are you like that in all aspects of your life?
Like
Would
intense and full of questions and kind of tortured? Yes.
your words, not mine. I was just thinking, like, would you take the initiative to call up somebody in a different
Oh,
setting and ask them all those questions?
yeah. I mean, I think in this particular case, I was just hungry. Like I knew I
Mm,
needed something. I needed a faith community. I couldn't do it by myself. But I was also very, very scared of being re-traumatized by any kind of conservatism that would close the house down again. That would just make me feel like I didn't have space. So I was
yeah.
cautious and curious at the same time.
Well, when you were on that faith vacation, early vacation from the community of faith, from the church, so to speak, what was it that you felt like you were missing? Because so many people they take their vacations and they're like, I don't know if anything's missing, and they spend an
Sure.
awful long time there. Was there something that just was
Sure. No,
gnawing
and
at you?
I honor that. And I think for some
Um,
people you really do need to have a long stepping away. And I don't blame anyone for that. I think for me, because I had grown up so thickly in community, I was a preacher's kid. We were always at church. That was where not just where our spiritual life happened, it was where life happened. It was where our
mm,
friends were. And so to move away from that completely felt very lonely. Um, I wanted, I mean, I'll admit it. I wanted like the potluck dinners and the place where
yeah,
you bring your kids and there's other moms who can like share stories with you.
yeah.
And, I wanted the fullness of that community to do life with. And I missed that too much to stay away too long.
Hmm. Okay. Um, so in large part, it was the fellowship. We don't have a whole lot of structures in our society like
Yes,
that anymore, do we?
absolutely. And specifically like intergenerational fellowship.
Mm,
We're so compartmentalized in our age groups and in our little tribes, and to actually have a place where my kids can, there'd be somebody who's 85 years old who will talk to them and like sit with them, who's not a relative, who's not necessarily grandpa or grandma. That's beautiful. For me to be able to engage with a teenager and have them not, kind of eye roll and walk away and maybe just we'll have like a little conversation for 2 minutes. That's a beautiful thing. And you're right, there are very few spaces now in American culture where that happens outside of church.
Again, we're talking with Debie Thomas, author of A Faith of Many Rooms. In the book, you bring up this idea of storied faith, or actually, I guess it's storied theology. How does that storied theology differ from just kind of a typical belief or a
Sure.
basis of theology?
Sure. So again, what I grew up with was a very belief oriented, belief centric faith, which meant that all of Christianity, my salvation came down to my making an intellectual assent to certain propositions.
Hmm.
Jesus is the Son of God, God is Trinity, you know, like the creed. And I
Yeah, it seems very dogmatic.
right, very
Like you
dogmatic.
check off
Right.
the things that you believe, and if you hit
Right.
all the marks, you're in.
And you're in. And if you have doubts or questions about any of them, then you're out. It was a very
Hmm.
clear line in the sand. Either you're in or
Okay.
you're out. And that's not how we do most of our lives. Our lives are more complicated than that. They're embodied. Our emotions play a role. Our relationships play a role. We have seasons. We move. There's an arc, a trajectory in our lives. And I think story captures more of that. That we're always in movement. That we're coming into contact with other characters in the story, and that affects us and shapes us. That God is also in the story with us. God is simultaneously the author and the participant in the story with us. And story gives us room to wrestle, right? It would be a very boring story. None of us wants to read a story in which, everything was good in the beginning and
Yeah.
everything was good in the middle and
So,
everything was good in the end. The end, like no one will read that book. That book will not sell. We
well,
want stories that have people struggling, overcoming things, learning things,
hmm.
discovering things. And so, isn't that a much more interesting and robust way of thinking about faith? That we will learn, we
Hmm.
will unlearn, we will have adventures, we will have tragedies, people will come alongside of us and help, people will annoy the heck out of us, and that's okay too. It's a much more, I think, rich way of looking at faith.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and that gives us then the room and encouragement to ask some of these questions rather than just the idea of, well, I was taught this, so I believe it.
Right, right. And even the idea that, we should we should believe at the beginning what we believe at the end without any change.
Yeah.
I think that's a problem. Christian Wyman, in his memoir, My Bright Abyss, has this beautiful line where he says, if I believe at 50 what I believed at 15, then I haven't lived. Because life moves forward. We should constantly be evolving and changing. That's a good thing. Not something to be afraid of.
Good. Well, as we're recording this, I'm not even sure that the book is released yet.
Soon.
So-
It'll be out March 19th.
That's right. Okay. So might be jumping the gun a little bit in this final question, but for you, the process of writing that book is done. And, now it's just kind of talking about what you've already accomplished.
Yeah.
Are you already thinking about what might come next? Is there a second book in there?
Oh, I'm thinking, yes. Well, there are possibilities. But actually right now I'm in seminary. I just started seminary this past summer. So right now all the writing is, research papers and theological reflections. And so it might take a while before I get around to having space for another book.
Yeah. Okay. Understood.
Yeah.
Well, when I entered seminary, there was an elderly gentleman from the congregation who warned me, don't let them take your faith when you go to their theological school.
You should know that from a lot of people. Don't let them take your faith. It is fascinating to think about. So far that hasn't happened. So far it's been good.
Well, I think the warning that comes is that in some ways they will rattle your faith. The process of it, when you're asking such deep questions and being exposed to so much, it is an unsettling experience. And
it is.
That's where that comes from. But it's also a tremendously growth encouraging experience as well, I think.
Yeah.
Again, because we're given that space to offer the questions and to really wrestle through what it is that we believe and why.
Absolutely.
Well, Debie, thank you so much for spending this time with us. And thank you for giving us these words that I found often articulate maybe questions that I had or ideas that I had that I wasn't able to put into words myself. So I really appreciate what you've offered.
Thank you so much for having me, Ryan. It was a pleasure.
Thank you for being part of the Compass community. We'll look forward to continuing to explore spirituality in the everyday with you. You might want to listen to another episode of Compass. I recommend it. And if you liked this episode, then I recommend episode 125, Cultivating Everyday Spirituality, with my friend Abigail Broca. Another good episode would be number 120, Discovering Evidence of the Divine. It gives some framework for dealing with tough questions of faith as well. And again, while you're listening, leave a rating and or review. The Compass Podcast is brought to you by United Methodist Communications. And that's all for this week. We'll be back with a new episode in 2 weeks, so I will chat at you then. Peace.